Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar on governance policies and procedures for third-party cybersecurity risk management. This is the 7th webinar in our 10-part series on cybersecurity and digitalization, with a focus on supply chain cybersecurity in the energy sector. I am Scott Morgan, Principal Consultant with Enernex, and I will help moderate today's webinar. So thank you all for joining us. Please note, as you heard in the announcement, this webinar is being recorded, and all participants have been muted. The recording will be made available after the webinar, along with a PDF of the presentation slides. We will be taking questions via the Q&A window, and we'll have time for Q&A after the presentation. So if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A window. Note, these are only shared with the presenters and hosts. And if we don't get to your question during the webinar, we will follow up with you and provide an answer afterwards. Today's event is organized through U.S. Energy Association's Advancing Modern Power Through Utility Partnerships, AMP-UP program. The AMP-UP program is funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And as I mentioned a moment ago, today's webinar is part of a 10-part series. The overarching goal of this series is to discuss the cybersecurity challenges associated with the expanding supply chain necessary to address multiple transformations in the energy sector, including integration of renewables, deployment of grid edge technologies, integration of regional markets, etc. In today's webinar, we'll hear from Terry Khalil, Senior Consultant at Ampere Industrial Security and CEO founder of Cyber Kaleidoscope, LLC. We will also hear from Roland Miller III, Ambassador for Cyber Florida, the Florida Center for Cybersecurity. Terry is a cybersecurity and compliance professional with a reputation for success in building and sustaining cross-functional compliant cybersecurity reliability programs in highly complex, regulated energy-critical infrastructure. Terry recently established Cyber Kaleidoscope, to provide cybersecurity services targeting critical infrastructure and industrial control systems and operational technology. She's also a senior consultant with Ampere Industrial Security, Inc. Previously, she was the Director of Technology Delivery, Performance Optimization, and Compliance for Tampa Electric Company. She also held Information Security and Risk Analyst and Senior Manager roles for PricewaterhouseCoopers. Roland is a Senior Information Technology Executive with over 20 years of experience in securing national critical infrastructure, such as downstream natural gas, nuclear power plants, and the electric grid. As a former Chief Information Security Officer, his expertise spans various domains, including business process optimization, innovation, metrics development, operational technology, and regulatory compliance. In his current role as an ambassador for Cyber Florida, the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, Roland drives engagement, conducts outreach efforts, consults with asset owners and operators, contributes to risk assessments and incident response exercises, and has created material for and conducts workshops on essential cybersecurity concepts. So before I turn it over to them, one last reminder to our audience, please enter any questions during the presentation via that Q&A window. And if we don't answer them along the way, we'll have time after the presentation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Terry and Roland, if you would please take it away.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks everyone for joining. We're going to talk today about the governance policies and procedures for third-party risk management, and our objectives are to focus on the organizational aspects of the governance and best practices, with the highlights on typical models for managing cybersecurity and the level of visibility into the associated cybersecurity risks for all of the relevant stakeholders. And we'll discuss some strategies and approaches to communicating within the organization and also with regulatory authorities. And we will also touch upon the cyber investments in capital and operational maintenance expenses.
And I know that this webinar series isn't a hard progression, but there are a couple of webinars that we feel were foundational to what we're discussing today. So we do assume that you have taken a look at webinar 2 and webinar 3. These are both components that will be integrated or operationalized using the methodologies that we're going to be discussing today. So please make sure that you take a look at these two as you dig deeper into what we're discussing.
So you may have already picked a set of standards, or you might have a regulation, or maybe you haven't yet. And you might be wondering, well, how do I get started? And typically in your company, you might have a code of business conduct or a corporate compliance committee, a regulatory affairs team, and so on. So you may be able to leverage some of those, but you're going to build some sort of governance function. And typically what I like to see is 3 tiers: your executive senior sponsorship, this is your officers, a director level steering committee, and then a working group of subject matter experts from all of the relevant areas, the leads and the managers. And you'll flesh this out over time. We're going to talk about that a bit in a few minutes. And you'll also want to set up a charter that talks about, why you're doing this, the responsibilities, the scope, and so on. So what can go wrong, Roland?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Terry. So I'm not gonna, I mean, as you guys read this slide, I mean, I'm gonna focus on just a couple of these things. Mainly it's if you don't have a centralized procurement in your organization, this really is a limiting factor, or at least a foundational piece. As you think about most frameworks in security, the very first thing that you do is to identify the scope of what you're trying to do. So this is third party risk management. So if you don't have an existing method of identifying your third party engagements, and every organization has third parties, you can't do things alone these days on anything. Typically, that's through a procurement. This you're going to need to probably set that up first. But even if you do have centralized procurement, I've seen instances where maybe there's legacy processes in place that allow for purchases through P cards or through credit cards that don't go through the same level of rigor. They don't have they in the past didn't have contracts associated with them, so they didn't go through the same level of rigor. You need to be sure that you're aware of those, because these days technology can be introduced, and therefore the risk associated with technology can be introduced through these purchases that may not have gone through the same level of rigor, and they do now. And the biggest example of that is software as a service, or the cloud, so to speak, where it's very easy for employees to just put their credit card in, get reimbursed by the company, but they've agreed to a contract through the EULA, and they may be putting your data up in the cloud, and you're not aware of this. So it's critical that you're aware of any of these blind spots, or these ways that purchases occur that didn't go through central procurement. And as you read through the other options, or the other things that can go wrong, hopefully they're straightforward. Organizational culture is a big thing. We're going to talk more about how to address that, but not matching up with your organizational culture can be another way that things go wrong at the very start.
So how to figure out who needs to be involved when you are embarking on setting up some third-party risk management policies and processes in your organization. Obviously, procurement's going to be involved, but who are the other common stakeholders? So depending on how your company is organized, you want to look at the functional areas. And if you have multiple affiliates, or maybe you have sort of not duplicated, but you might have representation in multiple countries or cities, states, provinces, and so on. So you'll want to look at the geography and see who might need to be involved there. Key decision makers need to be a part of it, but also think about who might be harmed from the failure of a third-party risk management program, or who can influence it, and even the third parties that you deal with themselves, and then anyone in the company that deals with it. Also, you need to think about any key influencers in your company, and those might not be a director, a lead, or a manager. They might be an engineer, or just someone that people respect, and maybe when you'll know them because maybe you're in a meeting and people are kind of quiet until that person speaks up and starts asking questions, and they kind of know which way that person might be headed, and then they'll start talking and participating. So you want to make sure you get them involved early. And you can document all of these folks in an org chart or even a responsibility, accountability, consulted, and informed matrix, a RACI matrix. And what you come up with for the project will eventually become part of your ongoing engagement plan. Roland?
And the things that can go wrong here, the things that Terry and I have seen in the past, a lot of, as you read through this list, a lot of them are self-explanatory. So what I want to touch on or go into a deeper focus here is the third-party inclusion. Some of you may not think that the third parties are stakeholders and should be at the table, and honestly, they should be. Now, they may not be at the very beginning when you're standing up your process for evaluating risk of third parties, but ultimately they are part of the process. They're the ones that will be subject to the information gathering. They'll be the ones having to deal with the contract language. They'll be the ones going through the process. And you need to have a way to identify their criticisms or any feedback that they may have to improve your process. And again, they may not be at the table at the beginning, unless you have a third party that you truly trust and want to have them there at the beginning to help make sure your process that you develop has their input at the beginning. But ultimately, you will find that you need to have them at the table later on. You need to ensure that whatever you build has a way to gather that feedback and most importantly, integrate it back into your process for improvement. The other things here, hopefully are self-explanatory, but culture, I go back to that, company and cultural differences and identifying that, even with your suppliers as well, is important to take into consideration because it could cause implementation issues.
And how do we get executive buy-in? Well, in some cases, it might actually be your executives or officers that have asked for some additional attention to third-party risk management. Sometimes it's the CISO or legal that brings it forward. And for the implementation, it's usually easier to get the buy-in if it's a regulation. But even if it isn't, making sure that you're focusing on the risks that would lead to a loss of revenue or a major loss of business operations, which in turn leads to loss of revenue, is going to be key. So really being able to speak in the language, that the executives want to hear. Typically, they're going to want to know the costs. And getting agreement to proceed, you may need to do a phased approach and sort of demonstrate some small wins with that. It's complicated. There's a lot of things you need to do. So maybe you start small. And Roland, what can go wrong with this?
Well, you covered some of that. I mean, not going into the costs, not speaking into business terms. I've seen that happen many times, and really, some executives or some leadership may just say, "Oh, this is compliance," and they don't question it. But the really good leaders are going to question how you're doing it, why you're doing it. Is there a different way to do it? Is there a different timing to do it? Especially if it's a significant expenditure and the competing priorities, they're going to have to make hard decisions about whether they, upgrade equipment or they implement a compliance program. So don't go into this saying, hey, this is compliance and we need to do it, even though that is a solid argument. You may be encountering situations where you have to go deeper and actually show that you've done your due diligence to think about other ways of doing it that may reduce the cost or the impact of the organization. Because remember, most times your organization isn't there to be compliant. Compliance is not the product they're producing. So there is going to be competition. There is going to be the need for prioritization. And you want to be able to speak these things, communicate this stuff in business terms and translate it into business terms, because most often your leadership is coming from the operational side or from a different industry. And, they're not going to understand unless you have done that translation. Terry?
So this slide has a lot of content on it, and I did that on purpose because I wanted to demonstrate just some of the things that you need to think about and how complicated organizational change management can be, because you might be doing some level of security awareness at the same time, as well as letting people know that there is a change company coming, giving that awareness. But it's kind of a lot of things that you're doing at the same time. So over on the left, we've selected one model to show here in terms of organizational change management models. And by the way, that's an entire MBA class in and of its own. But if you take, there's a lot of different models. If you take them and plot them out and you look at them going across, they're all very similar, whether they have 5 steps or 8 steps. So this one has just the 5 steps, creating the awareness and then creating the desire that, hey, I'm going to like this change eventually, creating the knowledge about it, and then creating the ability with the processes to handle the change, and then making sure that you are doing some sort of regular reinforcement. So, once you've implemented a policy and made people aware and taught them what they need to do, then coming back a few months later and checking in, whether it's a survey or celebrating, hey, we avoided a great risk by doing X, or whatever it is to do the reinforcement. And by the way, you'll want to make sure that you review these policies and procedures on a regular basis. You may do it early. You may find a sentence or two that's really problematic in the policy that you need to address pretty quickly. But then once you get into a cadence, you could probably do an annual review. And keep in mind that when you're doing the communicating, you have to let people know what is the true value. Why are we doing this? And what if we don't do it? And create that desire by uh, telling stories and attracting the emotion. And again, some of this will be your external stakeholders. Like they talked about in one of the earlier webinars, um, you could vendors can end up with a lot of different questionnaires coming in from people, and it's hard for them to respond. So thinking of ways to help them with that. And then part of the reinforcement, once you've implemented, is to check that the processes are properly implemented and are being followed. So some sort of assessment. And then over on the right, you've got some dimensions of security culture. Security culture is really your organizational culture. And so these are just some pieces of information about that. Um, and then making sure that the new people coming into the company are aware of the procedures. So there's a lot going on in there, a lot to think about in terms of organizational change management. But where can we go wrong with that?
That's funny, Terry. As I'm sure you guys can imagine, a lot can go wrong here. It is, and I'll reinforce what Terry said. This is not this could take up multiple webinars, many days, an entire graduate level class to get into the theory, because you're really dealing with sociology and psychology and how humans deal with change. So the stuff here on the left, I'm not going to go through it. These are all the ways that things can go wrong when you try to implement change in an organization. And the methodologies that you choose to guide you through organizational change management, all of these things are built in. In other words, the methodologies are designed to identify the common ways that changes can be, the barriers to change that humans go through or organizations go through, and ways to identify where you are or what the issue is. And then they also give you ways to address that and move forward. And again, this is not simple. It's not, but it's absolutely important, because what we're trying to do here ultimately is build a culture of or establish a culture of compliance, especially around third-party risk. And this is something that most companies don't have in place now. So you're looking at really, the bread and butter of organizational change management, which again is the things that can go wrong are on the left. On the right are some practical issues that could happen if what you implement isn't fully baked into your processes or your culture, or the change isn't fully embedded in or implemented. And ultimately, you're looking at impacts to the business due to delays in third-party contracting. You may not have parts of the company following the process. You can have issues downstream where you've gone in and you've already signed a contract with a third-party vendor. They're implementing something, and you realize that it's causing a security issue that could have been identified earlier if your process had been more robust in terms of the information gathering. At which point you're having to redo, or you're missing milestones. This causes a lot of business disruption. That if your third-party risk management process doesn't surface this stuff soon enough for you to take care of it upstream, it has downstream impacts, which is what we have outlined here on the right. Terry?
So the biggest part of this is figuring out what the risks are and raising those risks up and having the discussions about them. And so in performing the risk assessment processes, you may find something, let's say it's a piece of hardware or software, and you're not comfortable with the vendor's authentication practices. And so you need to figure out, well, does that mean we change vendors? Who do we raise that up to, and so forth? Or it may mean it's a deviation from one of your internal policies and standards, potentially specific to third-party risk management. And so your technical staff may be the first ones to bring that out, or your cybersecurity or compliance staff. But the compliance and cybersecurity staff are typically the ones that'll help translate those risks into business terms and help figure out what the mitigations are or the remediations, what triggers that. And what's key to this, and whenever you're implementing policies and standards, you've got to have a process to manage those policies and standards, review them on a periodic basis, and so on. And within that, an exceptions process. And that's where the governance comes into play. And so an exceptions process will typically have, what standard are we deviating from? Who owns it? Who are the different players that have to know about and sign off on it? What is the actual risk? What is the potential risk? What's the likelihood? And it, in essence, becomes your risk register. And so you can figure out kind of a form to put together and different views of it. And based on your naming conventions, you can have a component of that is your third-party risk register. And you'll want to get that in front of your CISO, even your CIO, your business leaders. You would never want someone, let's say, in a power plant to not know that there was some risk with the things that run the plant, and sign off on it. So you've got to get that communication out there for the ones that warrant it. It might not be every single little thing, but the ones that are the riskier ones, you'll want to do that. Roland?
Thanks, Terry. So what I've seen go wrong here, as you guys read through this list, first one I'll tick off is inappropriate business approvals. So what I've seen is project level managers where their motivation is to get something in, and they're more than happy to sign off on whatever risks are identified by the security team, regardless of what the impact is to the company. Their motivations and their scope may not perfectly align with what the risk itself is. And I've seen many manager and director level entities or persons wanting to sign off on high risk to the company, and that's simply not appropriate. And that's why it's important to have a risk sign off matrix that does, the higher the risk or the residual risk, the higher the approval needs to be. Because again, in my career, I have not had an issue where if it's been identified as a high residual risk, that a senior person has wanted to sign off on it. They simply haven't. But the key to that also is being able to communicate that risk in business terms. That is so important because oftentimes these risks that are identified are highly technical. They're very esoteric. They have to deal with IT technology, and business people tend to have their eyes glazed over unless they come from that area. And you need to help them with that. They're the ones that are signing off on it. They need to have the information given to them in a form that they can digest it and understand it. And that's why the translation of these risks to business terms is so incredibly important and critical to enabling this entire process. So the other things here, I think, are pretty straightforward. They have ramifications downstream in the sense that these are things that may not come up as issues at the beginning, but if you're not documenting sufficiently documenting deviations, if you're not following up, you're kind of probably have issues downstream that may come up in an audit. And if this is tied directly to regulatory compliance, that would be the regulator finding them. And those are typically bad days for most organizations. And then the last bullet there is if your process doesn't allow for exceptions, if it doesn't allow for flexibility, typically most humans don't do well with those types of processes. So be sure that you are, as you're going through your governance with your stakeholders, that you're taking into account, ways that your processes can fail, which includes people not wanting to go through them and thereby bypassing them. Terry?
So we talked earlier about executive buy-in, and part of that buy-in is that you're probably going to need some sort of funding. If you're doing a lot of risk assessments, that's really hard to do without some sort of tool to help you keep track of your vendor responses, the mitigations, the risks, and so on. Or you might need, maybe your contract folks didn't have a contract management tool before, so maybe that, even though it's not directly tied to it, maybe there's pieces that will help you with the third party risk management. And so, as we mentioned earlier, you have to really make sure you explain, why are we doing this? What is the value? Why do we have to do it right now? Can we do it later? And why do we have to do it this way? And then what happens if we don't do it? And so a lot of the things that have to occur to get a project like this spun up are uh, what we in our accounting standards in the US know as operations and maintenance types of things. It's not an asset that you're going and buying and capitalizing to put a process in place. But again, if you've got a tool, then you can probably capitalize that, depending again on your accounting regulations in your country. But typically those capital expenditures are preferred in a utility. But then you also have to consider the ongoing costs. After you get all this set up, what is it going to take to keep all of these processes going? You're spending extra time doing the risk assessments, reviewing that, having the discussions with the vendors on contract language. There's a lot of things that have to happen day to day, and so you might need headcount. So how do you justify and explain that? And again, it's keeping it in the very high level terms, but you need to consider those post-project costs as well. And what can go wrong with that?
So as you guys read through this list, it's hopefully they're self-explanatory. The not putting it in business context or business value, even though it may be, hey, we need to do this because of regulatory compliance. Hey, we have to do this for cybersecurity. Those are, again, good arguments, but again, the really good leadership is going to push back on that a little bit deeper and challenge your assumptions and possibly go into the financials that you have. And some of this is very difficult to translate into financial terms in terms of, profit and loss and whatnot. So, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to go through that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't avoid, or that you should avoid doing the probabilities of the impact and whatnot, because it just makes your business case stronger. Because ultimately that's what it is. It's going to be a business case that has to stand or should stand on its own against other business cases and other priorities within your organization. And typically those other areas are coming in with here's our financials, here's why we're doing it, here's the business value, here's what happens if we don't do it. And again, typically, in cybersecurity or in compliance, this is exercising skills that may not be in the forefront of people on your team. Typically we're very technical IT type backgrounds, and this is getting deep into business fundamentals and accounting and economics and finance. So bridging that gap is really very important, and we've been hammering that pretty much from the very start. The last bullet here is what I really want to spend a few minutes on, is not understanding really the operationalization of what you're doing, whether it's the third-party risk management that we've been talking about, or any type of cyber investments that may be part of the cyber program and may not be associated with compliance or third parties. But ultimately, it's all these things need to be operationalized. They need to have some sustainability. And this is the part that I've seen most organizations don't get it right at the beginning. And that's, establishing sustainable compliance, sustainable operations. And in my opinion, that the key to that is integrating it into your culture, a culture of compliance, a culture of security. And like I said, I haven't seen any organization do that right out of the gates. They all struggle with it. And this is just another area that you need to understand will probably go down that same road where you're coming back to it over and over again until you have established a type of culture of compliance, which takes years. Ultimately, if you take a step back, really putting this into place so that it sticks takes years. It involves, complex things like organizational change management, like we were talking about. And these are the things that, in my opinion, ultimately are the long-term things that you should be focusing on as you implement bits and pieces of a compliance program. And with that, I believe we are at questions and answers stage. Terry, is there anything else you want to add before we to wrap this up before we do that, since we've got a little bit of time?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that it's really important to have a foundation, for how you manage your policies. Whether you use a COBIT foundation or a NIST risk management framework and ISO 17799, but something that where you've got policies about how you manage policies and where they're stored, how they're reviewed, how they're approved, who owns them, the cadence of reviews, and then, like I mentioned, how do you do the exceptions? That's really a key foundation for anything, third-party risk management or any other cybersecurity related or IT related policies, IT and OT that you have. So do we have any questions, Scott?
Yes, let me kind of jump in some of these. So I guess I wanted to dig in a bit on the organizational change management comment. Do you have any specific recommendations for evaluating whether internal policies are being followed and having the intended effect, and that change is being affected the way that you want it to be?
So one thing that you could do is kind of a mock audit or a self-assessment against that to assess it. And so you would look for, and if you've got a regulation, you're going to have the evidence. If you don't have a regulation, you may not have really discussed it from that standpoint. But you want to see if there's been an attempt to get the appropriate contract language into the contracts. You'll need to track the purchases that are in scope for your organization, to see if did we do the risk assessment? Did we identify risks? Did we follow up on those risks? Because the point isn't to just identify them and talk about them. You want to have mitigations in place, or, if it was such a high risk that you changed vendors. So just following up to see if those have been done. And so you could do that via a third-party mock audit or an internal self-assessment. Roland, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, the one tool I love for understanding what's going on in terms of organizational change management, really it's the simple survey. It's SurveyMonkey, it's forms from Microsoft. A well-crafted question to the right audience, given anonymity, will give you a lot of understanding as to do they understand what the policy is? Do they even know where it is? Can they, it asking just simple questions and just surveying, keeping it simple, of course, just to less than 5 questions, you learn a tremendous amount of information about what you're trying to focus on in terms of where the change has, is it successful, and ultimately what is preventing the change from being successful. So most organizational change management methodologies have survey forms, they have questions you can ask that will tease out not only how successful is it or where is it being hung up in necessarily in the process of how humans go through change, and then you can take that information and do mitigations.
Yeah, and typically folks, if you talk to folks that have participated in creating the processes, whether it's procurement or cybersecurity, whoever's reviewing the risks or whoever's dealing with the contracts, they kind of know where the problem areas are. For example, if you've got some sort of purchase card capability, where you have a card that you can just go out and do small purchases, those may not be tracked centrally through procurement. And so it's, through an accounts payable function. And so that can be an area where we miss things. Or subscriptions are another one. You might not realize it when you're signing up for a subscription. It might be just someone out in the business thinking, hey, I'm just, signing up for the simple tool. But you're actually signing a contract when you do that with a third party. And if that isn't being looped through procurement, and if there aren't controls in place to catch those by whoever sees those purchases, then you're going to miss some things.
Okay, yeah, no, great, thanks. Roland, I had one pretty specific question for you, actually. I think on the organizational change management slide and sort of what goes wrong, I think one of the bullets was that you can kind of get trapped into thinking tactically. I guess, can you go explain that a little bit more, as that kind of as opposed to strategically, and sort of what did you mean there?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. My apologies. Tactical versus strategic. You end up getting focused on solving a very particular problem, and then you end up forgetting that you're actually trying to do something bigger or longer term. It's a typical, in my opinion, human failing in becoming over focused on what's right in front of you, that's operational, that's the fire, and forgetting that you're trying to push probably a longer term strategic change. And you may not want to spend so much time addressing this small tactical issue, and you should be spending more time, pushing something that is more strategic or long term in terms of change. Hopefully that answers your question.
No, thanks. That's perfect. Yeah. Kind of a follow-up on that a little bit. Do you ever see something that has sort of unintended consequences? Are there policies that you think, okay, this is what we need to do, this is the problem, we're trying to think long term, and before you know it, you've caused a new problem. Yesterday's solution is tomorrow's problem, kind of deal. And how do you kind of correct course if that happens?
Harry, you got a big smile on your face.
Yeah, I'm just only trying to think of one that I could share.
Sorry.
I don't have one coming to mind that I could actually share right now.
So
Yeah,
that does.
yeah, I'm trying to think of something. I mean, it's when you're in cybersecurity, a lot of people think that you're taking things away from people and you're saying no, and really it should be you're informing people of risk and so they can make, good risk-based decisions and not just go into something blind and make an unintended issue. So I guess the way I would answer that is the intent of this is risk management. It's not to take things away. It's not because depending on your company culture or your organizational culture, if it's very intense and it's very results driven, any time that you are perceived as introducing red tape or unnecessary this or that, and people don't understand it, they're going to try to find a way around it. I mean, that's human nature, and that's just in general, not a specific example of where if you come across that way, and you don't change that, then people will find a way to sign a contract with somebody and just push it through procurement and it never goes through legal review and next thing you know your security team's reviewing a product after the fact, after the bond, after it's been implemented. So that does happen, and just being aware of everything we talked about should prevent that. Having the right stakeholders, communicating the change, socializing it should prevent the organization from rejecting ultimately what you're trying to do and work around it.
And so two follow-ons to that, and one is again just emphasizing the capability for the exceptions, through a documented process where it gives the visibility, you get to have the discussions, and it doesn't have to be rigid unless it needs to be rigid in your particular environment. If you're some sort of nuclear facility, you might be more rigid than some other, types of assets. And then the other piece is, when if you've got people going off and doing their own thing, then when we have like a 0-day vulnerability, and the security team's trying to figure out what we've got in the environment, and you're going off and doing your own thing and you've got equipment in there that nobody else knows about, then that's also a risk. So just my thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. No, thank you. So I think one thing I feel like I've heard stories about is that IT cybersecurity IT often gets tasked with leading the cybersecurity effort, but they don't always have really great understanding of the way that OT works. And so you're kind of pointing there about we're not here to try and take things away. We're trying to enable the process. I mean, do you ever see that where IT security practices kind of start to get in the way of the availability on the OT side? And kind of how do you address that?
Yeah, I think it's really creating that awareness. It depends on your organizational structure, and you're right. A lot of times the cybersecurity function might be in IT, but generally there's someone that kind of crosses over, at least maybe going up to the perimeter for OT security. But what I've tried to do is help people understand OT better. If you're coming from IT, and then to help the OT folks understand the IT pieces. And there's a NIST set of standards, and it's not going to come to me. I think it's 800, maybe it's 800-82, but it's the one on operational technology. And there's actually an appendix, I think it's Appendix F, where it explains different risks in the OT environment. And I tell people in IT that when your OT engineers are telling you something about their equipment, when you've raised an implementation thing that that you want to talk to them about pushing out, and you might perceive them as pushing back, but really they're telling you the same thing as what's written in that appendix. So that kind of like, if you go and read that before you talk to them, you'll be in closer alignment. So I'm not too sure how much that applies to third party risk, but I think it still does, just trying to help each other collaborate, and get to a point where you're talking to each other. And I think industry has made a lot of progression in that. There's a lot of resources out there to help with that
No,
these
absolutely.
days. So.
Actually, you're kind of reminding me of an example where it seemed like IT did not appreciate that the OT vendor really had a strong need to be able to have some sort of remote access to do this troubleshooting on a something that they had provided, and that became sort of a point of contention of not following the sort of standard IT protocols. So yeah, so
Well, I think one thing we all have to keep in mind is that a lot of the OT environment was designed for safety and reliability, but it wasn't designed for misuse. And so having that mindset now is it's kind of a change. So that's happening over time to say, I designed it, it's safe, it's safety of life and that kind of thing. But if someone's going to go in and intentionally misuse it, then you have to think about a different set of controls for that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been hearing about IT/OT convergence for probably 20 years now. They're not going to completely converge. There are different reasons for OT to exist. There are different requirements. It's a different culture. It's a different set of people. And quite honestly, in my opinion, it's always going to be that way. So there needs to be that bridge, that understanding that OT is different. You need to collaborate, you need to work together because ultimately there are risks in the OT environment. And even though it may be the same technology at the base, there are different, again, operational requirements that cause the standard IT controls to not be applicable. So it's critical in your organization to understand that divide, if there is a divide between IT and OT, you need to bridge that gap. You need to be speaking the same, at least not speaking the same language, but talking to each other because ultimately you're both on the hook for resolving or mitigating risk, even if it comes, in this case, it'd be coming from an OT vendor, like you mentioned, Scott. And just knowing that they're different is the best start, and then trying to bridge that gap is the best way to mitigate it, in my opinion.
yeah, and kind of goes right back to what you presented at the beginning of having those key stakeholders, having the right people involved in developing it. If you're not hearing from the OT side, then you're more likely to miss exactly what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
I guess another kind of thought you raised in handling exceptions. Do you ever see sort of policies around when risks are realized? So, if you, it doesn't necessarily have to be if you had an exception in place, but just, sort of the worst has happened, sort of what policies do you put in place in order to, I guess, kind of come back from when a risk is realized?
Well, it sounds like that would translate into your incident planning and response policies, plans, procedures. And, I think a lot of folks in the energy space are really good at that. With the mutual assistance programs and close tie-ins with our federal law enforcement agencies and that kind of thing. Um, and a lot of companies also, because of their need for things like storm management or other disaster management, they've got a lot of emergency management procedures, and the cybersecurity piece can tie in. And so if a third party risk translates to a cybersecurity incident or issue, it's probably just going to float over to the to either your all hazards emergency management approach or your cybersecurity planning in
Yep.
response.
I agree with that. That's what came to mind as well. Realize risk isn't as a cyber event, and you should have an instant response and or business continuity DR policy or procedures to handle that. And the most important part of those procedures are they should have, a feedback mechanism built in at the end. They should have a lessons learned piece where you incorporate what you've learned from that, which in this case sounds like you would have some learnings that would go back into your third-party risk management process or procedures that need to be implemented so it doesn't happen again in the future.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Um, so I guess maybe kind of final question here. When it comes to sort of making changes to these policies, do you see sort of an appropriate cadence to do it? I imagine, you're putting too much out there all at once. Everyone's gonna be like, what is the latest thing? What were we supposed to do again? Or, too much confusion there. So kind of managing that level of expectation.
Yeah, I've seen, and Terry, you can, we may have the same answer here. I've seen at a minimum, policy update cadence or review every 2 years. That's kind of the maximum. I said minimum. That's the maximum you want to have a policy sit out there without being reviewed. A minimum, I think, for most organizations, if you're updating something more than once a year, that's way too fast. It's too much change necessarily to push through an organization. So really the best cadence has been between 1 and 2 years that I've seen in my experience. And obviously it depends on your culture. It all goes back to culture and understanding how quickly things move. You may have policies that can sit there for more than 2 years, but as long as you have a checkpoint to say, hey, has anything material changed here, then they can sit there for another 2 years. That's what I've seen as best practice. Terry?
Well, and I think in your policy review process, you have a capability to change, you don't have to wait until that review date. If you've got something, whether it's a minor or major change that needs to be updated, and if it's a major change, you'll want to communicate around that. And so, especially as you are first implementing, like I said, if you all got together and consensus on the way it was written, and then once you started implementing, some piece of it becomes really problematic and you find you need to change it, then you should change it. But you don't want to change it every month, because then you'll maybe start to lose some credibility there. But I agree with Roland, 1 to 2 years. My personal preference is about every year, and just, getting people accustomed to that. And I agree, it depends on your organizational culture as well.
Okay. I agree. I think I've heard my boss joke about how so many businesses are managed by astrology because we do things by calendar years, but there is something about it that just sort of feels natural to align to. So I'm with you. I wanted to try out kind of one thought in that I had in listening to some of these descriptions. In particular, Roland, you kind of mentioned a culture of compliance. I think you've heard some stories or concerns that you know a culture of compliance potentially not leading to security. But so the thought I had is, maybe that means that a sign of good policies is that, a culture of compliance does overlap well with a culture of security. Is that kind of, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, compliance and security are different things. They can lead you down different roads. But if you do both of them correctly, you're on parallel paths. And again, you're dealing with culture, which is multi-year time span is what those things are. These aren't simple projects you just set and forget. That's why it's so hard, and a lot of organizations struggle with this.
Great.
And I think all of it ties back to your organizational culture, having an accountable culture, playing to the goals of the company, that are set, at the executive level, and just making sure you're holding yourself and your teams accountable.
Okay, great. Well, that's, I think, all the questions I had and questions that I saw come in. So I guess any final words for our audience, and then we'll kind of let you go to the rest of your day.
Well, I appreciate the time. Thanks for inviting us to join. I'm open to, hearing additional questions if people have any. And I'm looking forward to seeing the handbook.
Yep. Thank you for your time. I hope somebody learned something from this and it was valuable. That was my goal, is that this was useful to someone out there. And obviously if there's questions afterwards, I'm also open to answering them afterwards.
Great. Okay, well, in that case, let me say thank you to Terry and Roland for sharing your expertise and your experience. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for the webinar. So just a reminder, the recording of today's webinar will be uploaded to USEA's YouTube channel, and a link or potentially even an embedded video will be added to the event page along with a PDF of the presentation slides. So next up, we have the 8th webinar in this series, which will actually be held in 3 weeks this time on April 11th, and will cover managing cybersecurity risks in a rapidly expanding electric grid. So webinars continue to proceed every other week thereafter. So please be on the lookout for the email announcements or visit usca.org/events. And if you missed previous webinars in the series or want to go watch the 2 that Roland and Terry referenced, you can see them on the USCA event page as well as USCA's YouTube channel. So thank you again to everybody for joining today. We hope to see you at the next webinar on April 11th. So have a great rest of your day.
Bye.